Good morning, good afternoon, or maybe even good evening to wherever you are joining us from the world today. I am Cristina Gamboa. I am the CEO of the World Green Building Council. I'm very excited to be speaking with you today about WorldGBC's new policy program and share with you for the first time our global policy principles for a sustainable built environment. We hope these principles will motivate you as a key stakeholder in the construction ecosystem to engage with your local policymaker to support greater policy ambition and close the gap to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. I am joined today by an excellent panel of experts representing different regions of the world, and of course, different stakeholder constituencies who will speak to us about their experience and the urgency behind developing sustainable building policies. So the panel today with us is Rosilena Lindo-Riggs. She's the Undersecretary National of the National Energy Secretariat of the Government of Panama. Brian Dean, the Head of Energy Efficiency and Cooling SE for All. And Luis de Melo, Director of Economics Department for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. And finally, Melanie Slade, she's the Senior Program Manager, Energy Efficiency in Emerging Economies Program at the International Energy Agency, IEA. So welcome, everyone. So before we hear from you, I want to introduce the work that we're launching today from WorldGBC and how we can collaborate to drive this agenda forward together. So the World Green Building Council is a network around the world in over 77 countries. And we believe we are a great local, regional, global action network to lead the transformation for a sustainable built environment. So we work with businesses, organizations, and governments to deliver on the ambition of the Paris Agreement and the UN Global Goals for Sustainable Development, the SDGs. And our motto is sustainable and decarbonized built environments for everyone, everywhere. The strategy of our network is to transform the building and construction sector across three main impact areas that together define a holistic definition of sustainability and ambitious carbon mitigation and adaptation. So those three pillars are climate action, health, equity, and resilience, and finally, resources and circularity. So through these entry points, we engage in our global network, and with collaborating with businesses and governments, we want to contribute and make sure our sector is on track to deliver on the Paris Agreement and the SDGs. We do take forward a systems change approach, and through that, we catalyze the uptake of better quality infrastructure and solutions around the world. And in that way, we intend to do our part to lead the transition towards a net zero, healthy, equitable, and resilient built environment. As we all know, this next decade is crucial for our sector to get on track to halve emissions by 2030 or more. And we now have the solutions, and we need to implement those necessary measures. The urgency is quite palpable. Just a couple of weeks ago, the IPCC report released the data and the findings that are truly, well, should be shocking, but it's not really surprising because we have been hearing the calls, but not being able to act at the speed and scale it deserves. The world is rapidly approaching to concerning levels of heating, and the international climate goals seem to slip out of reach. And we want to take radical action. As the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said, this report, referring to the IPCC, is a clarion call to massively fast-track climate efforts by every country and every sector on every time frame. And that includes particularly the built environment, because it is responsible for 37% of energy-related carbon emissions and 34% of energy demand. So we can no longer just talk about building better, more sustainable buildings, because the sector is not on track. The research by Global ABC and the IEA is showing us precisely that. So we will be having a dual challenge, and no doubt about it, because some markets are still growing their building stock, they need it, they're still urbanizing, but in other regions, we're grappling with the challenges of energy renovation, of inefficient buildings, up to standards that deliver on those decarbonization pathways and goals. So achieving the reductions in the building sector is quite challenging, no doubt, but we need to decouple energy use from floor area growth, and that is key all over the world. So the challenge is, how do we decarbonize while we still grow? But we know that we can find the key accelerators through the support of policymakers. These leaders must take bold leadership now to unlock the potential of the built environment. And as the G7 climate ministers prepare to meet this weekend, it is critical that they recognize the transformative potential of the built environment to address the climate challenge. So WorldGBC and its network, we're aligned. We recognize that we don't have the right policies in place to deliver on the ambitions that we need to tackle in the next few years. So that's why we've developed the Global Policy Principles for a Sustainable Built Environment. In partnership with our GBCs, these principles guide governments when developing their building policies and programs. The principles cover 7 key topics: carbon, resilience, circularity, water, biodiversity, health and equity, and access. So by adopting a holistic approach to the application and incorporation of these principles, policymakers across all levels of government can ensure that policy and regulations are delivering the transformative action needed to reach the goals of the Paris Agreement. I've mentioned that the principles were developed with our network of green building councils and their members, our partners, and we have a task force that have focused on the applicability across diverse markets, and that includes countries such as Kenya, Australia, Ireland, and even my home country of Colombia. And through that exchange, we learned that despite the many differences that exist within various markets, they're all united across these common policy principles, these 7 common policy principles, agreeing that governments can build them out and get us on track to have the sector contribute its role in this carbon-free mitigation world. And of course, resiliency in terms as the climate impacts are already here. So I'm going to now go through the principles, and I'll just flag the headlines. And so starting with carbon, we're asking to prioritize renovation of existing buildings and eliminate both operational and embodied carbon across embodied emissions across the life cycle of buildings. In resilience, we're asking to enhance the abilities of homes and communities to respond to external shocks and stressors by integrating climate resilience and promoting adaptation. Circularity. We need to drive waste out of the construction value chain and minimize the use of primary materials by optimizing the use of resources and materials. Water, conserve and protect water resources and guarantee equitable access to potable water and sanitation. Biodiversity, regenerate natural systems and restore biodiversity loss by avoiding development on land with high biodiversity and by prioritizing nature-based solutions that enhance, expand, and protect the natural environment. Health, develop healthy, equitable, and resilient buildings and cities that deliver the improvement in occupants for communities, for our public health, for well-being across the full life cycle of infrastructure. And 7, equity and access. Support equal access to safe, healthy, sustainable homes and communities for all citizens. So these are it. These are the 7 principles. And we believe that governments can review them, get inspired, update their existing legislation so they align to these principles. And we are offering with our network all the support to implement them. So that's our launch today. And now I have the pleasure of introducing again the panel of experts to reflect on these principles, their perspectives. So again, thank you so much, Rosilena, Brian, Luis, and Melanie for joining us today. And Rosilena, if I may, can I start with you? Can we have some initial reflections on these principles and the role of policy in decarbonizing the building sector from your perspective.
Thank you, Cristina, and thank you everybody that is joining us today. My name, as Cristina said, is Rogelio Malinda. I'm the Secretary of Energy in Panama, and I've been working for the last 19 years in deeply analyzing how to find ways to develop and implement just and inclusive energy and climate policies while shortcutting time to meet the planetary deadlines that the IPCC has clearly identified in their several reports. Every day is more necessary to ensure that holistic approaches are carried out by maximizing the practical and agile synergies in the design of policies to take advantage of those challenges generated not only by the changing climate, but also by energy, by health, by development and inclusion. And in Panama, the design, development, and approval of and implementation of our national transition agenda have been nourished not only by the Paris Agreement and the Sustainable Development Goals, but also by studies and instruments that international organizations make available to entities that believe in the value of knowledge. But above all, in the value of implementing proposals that enable us to preserve and enjoy healthy natural resources, quality natural resources with inhabitants, citizens who live with quality. And for us, the global policy principles launched today will become the key reference in the development of transversal, holistic, people-centered policies to accelerate the identification of opportunities to contribute to decarbonization. As announced before a few minutes ago, the world must be on a carbonless diet with a reduction of 45% in the next 7 years of these emissions. But moreover, we do know that this carbonless diet has to be clearly focusing on the 37% of emissions that the building sector is responsible for. And usually when we are determined to become healthier, we need to define a healthy value, and including the identification of people that will give you a hand to continue in that healthy path. And the global policy principles represent that clear and ambitious menu of principles comprehensive enough to give room for implementation, taking into account the national circumstances of any type of stakeholders, not only decision makers, any type of stakeholders. These global policy principles for sustainable built environment are creating a robust link of network of stakeholders who will, I hope, refuse to give up on conquering sustainable development challenge. And in difficult and complex times, in times of change, principles increase the hope to strive harder than ever to meet global goals for a healthy and prosperous future. And from the 7 key areas on the report, I want to highlight its concrete focus towards resilience and how fundamental is that homes and communities are able to respond to external shocks and stressors by integrating climate resilience and promoting adaptation. And to do so, renewable distributed electricity generation will allow fastest and sustainable reactivation of building activities, including the provision of medical attention in front of a disaster. And I also want to emphasize the fundamental role of providing accurate and updated information as maps of flood risk areas to avoid building construction and vulnerable zones. But nowadays, when 6.92 billion people have smartphones in the world, as decision makers, we must keep communication open and fed with information and data that will enable climate smart decisions to be made by the population. And furthermore, there will be never successful energy transition without achieving universal access to energy. And this is directly linked with the decisions and actions we take today, and how the document highlights the need to develop strong collaborations among national governments and local governments to reach equality and access is part of the challenge that is essential. We never set aside. And last but not least, the recurring demand for financial incentives and/or mechanisms to support buildings optimization in any low carbon building energy system is really key to assure that the renovation around energy efficiency and rooftop solar must be considered in any transformational change in our buildings. We do appreciate the work and the support of the World Green Building Council to advance the sustainable development agenda. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosie, that's wonderful because actually you brought a vision, right, bringing close the energy transition to this transformation of the built environment, but also how the resiliency angle and people first approach is something that resounds with the work you lead in Panama. Thank you so much for your words. Brian, I would like to go to you. You've been in, now you are also come from the energy side of things. How do these principles, how do you feel they land in terms of the state of the world and the work you do?
Yeah, thanks, Christina. Yeah, my name is Brian Dean. I'm head of energy efficiency and cooling at SE4All. At Sustainable Energy for All, we are really working to achieve SDG 7 and this global energy transition in the interest of climate, energy security, and development, and to make sure that no one's left behind. So very similar to Rosie in that way, that we really want to make sure that no one is left behind. And I really like that the new principles are coming from the private sector, from the buildings industry, and saying, hey, we need more policies, we need better policies that will enable a more sustainable built environment. I also like that there's a series of components beyond the typically discussed energy lens. So you say, well, yeah, I'm coming from the energy world. There's not one that says, hey, energy, we need to do everything on energy. No, it sort of flips it around and says, we need to do things on a whole bunch of things where energy is affected by it. And that this is really a framework that policymakers can come together on for regulation, information, incentive policies, those three different component types. But I think probably the most important thing for the WorldGBC community is that I think this opens the doors to a different set of policymakers. You mentioned in the beginning that WorldGBC is a great community, local, regional, and global, and that it's both private sector and policymakers. But typically those policymakers are those involved with buildings or built environment. And I think this opens up the door to health ministries, to other development industries. And I think that's really a great outcome of this. And if you have an offer to say you're going to help those industries or those ministries improve their outcomes and supporting other sustainable development goals, I think that's a really great outcome from this, from my perspective.
Thank you so much, Brian, and thank you so much also on reflecting our journey. Yes, I'm super positive how this has now evolved towards that. Luis, hello. Same question to you. How do these principles resound? What's your take on them, and what do you think they mean?
Hi, Christina. Hello, everyone. It's really a great pleasure to join you today. Many thanks to you personally, Christina, and the World Green Building Council for the invitation. Congrats on the launch of the global policy principles. I can only join Brian and Rosie in highlighting how relevant the set of principles that you've identified is in terms of the topics that it covers, in terms of how they connect the most relevant aspects of the challenge that we are all facing now. I'm Luis de Mello. I'm the Director of Policy at the Economics Department of the OECD. We've been working on issues that are very much related to the conversation today for quite some time. Issues related to the efficiency of housing markets, affordability of housing, and the sustainability of the real estate or the building sector as a whole are also central to the work that we are doing. One thing I would say, Christina, that I find important to highlight is that we are really here today to talk a very important topic for policy, an important challenge that policymakers are facing around the world, regardless of the level of development of the country, regardless of the specific conditions of the building sector in different parts of the world. You mentioned yourself that housing is a very heavy user of energy in our societies, how much of energy consumption in our economies it accounts for. And as a result of that, how much of emissions worldwide can be traced back to housing, either directly or indirectly. So it's really impossible to think of national strategies to meet the agreed climate change targets without thinking of options to decarbonize the buildings sector. And I think that's also why it's so important, and I think clearly Brian and Rosie have mentioned it, so important to bring different policy communities and organizations together to join forces and share evidence that they may have, their experience, in a manner that can support policymakers around the world to deliver better, more sustainable housing buildings for their societies and their population. I mean, as I mentioned at the OECD, we are doing our share with our policy communities, with our interlocutors. We've been working over a number of years now on gathering empirical evidence, identifying a set of good practices, if you want, that could be used to guide policy choices. These three pillars that I mentioned a minute ago that we have in our work also feature very prominently in your principles. I think one can trace back to the 7 principles, issues related to the efficiency, to the affordability, and to the sustainability pillars that are underpinning our own work. I would say that the key challenge here for us is essentially to find ways to improve how housing markets work. And by housing here, I'm talking about the residential segment, but also the commercial segment in general, and to find ways of improving that efficiency in a manner that also delivers affordable and sustainable options for our societies as a whole. So I'm very happy to be able to join you today and to see how aligned, our different lines of work are in this common objective. After all, I think we'll all be judged on the basis of the policies and the recommendations and the good practices and principles that we put together here. The future generation will tell if we are wrong or not, but we are, I think, working together towards a common goal.
That's amazing. Thank you so much for finding those threads also to your priorities around efficiency, affordability, sustainability. That's excellent. I think we're here on a campaign also of gaining more momentum to partner up and cooperate to address all of this. But before I continue to I have so many questions, but I want to open the floor for Melanie, please. Melanie, your take from your work in the IEA and also your emerging markets imperative. How do you see the global policy principles in relation to what you work on and what you champion?
Thank you very much, Christina, and thanks everybody for the opportunity to be here. Clearly, there's a huge meeting of minds going on here. There's an alignment of thoughts, and everything that's laid out in these principles are things that we would advocate to emerging economies in particular, but of course everybody. But I suppose, in true IEA fashion, just to take a step back and look at the challenge, just to remind ourselves that, you talked about the 30% or more than 30% of energy consumption that buildings account for, and also the more than 30% of energy related emissions that buildings account for. We across the board need to see a doubling of the rate of improvement of energy efficiency, as we've been discussing for some years, and we're not seeing it. It's a real big challenge for policymakers around the world. We are seeing a bit of an increase in investment in energy efficiency, particularly in buildings in the last few years. Governments who have been implementing recovery programs post-COVID and now programs to boost economies, they are focusing quite heavily on buildings, which is of course a good thing. But across the board, we still need to see a tripling of investment in energy efficiency in order to try and meet our our net zero targets. We do have, of course, strong hopes for efficiency. We think that you know, if we didn't take concerted action on energy efficiency, we'd see an increase in about 30% of energy consumption from buildings already by the end of this decade. But that can be mitigated. You know, we could, instead of an increase in 30, we could see a drop of about 20, we think, if all cost-effective energy efficiency were acted upon according to these sorts of principles that we're seeing laid out. You know, by 2050, we could see an activity increase of basically doubling, almost 100% increase, but with almost zero emissions if we turn on all of the cost-effective energy efficiency options that we have. We still see that very little action, even though all sectors are important, very little action if policymakers don't take a strong stance here. And so there's a huge amount for governments to have to do. And hopefully these guidelines, along with the best practice that's shared by others, will actually help that happen. You know, we have our policy packages, as you know, for buildings energy efficiency, which apply to both new and existing buildings. You know, we talk a lot about both. Huge increases in floor area expected, but also by 2050 we think that about half the buildings that we have today will still be being used, so hugely important to work on those as well. That kind of lays the way open to make sure we talk about the buildings, but also what we put in them, so we make sure that we have policies that cover all of the lighting equipment and appliances that we put within our buildings. And of course, we have opportunities there for higher turnover, faster turnover of stock. So there are opportunities there for improving the efficiency of our existing building stock and the stock that we're building out. I think where we see this policy package approach going, and you know, I know it's encompassed in everybody's thinking these days, is you know, how we modernize those traditional policies. So we need to make sure our appliance standards have demand response readiness built into them. So ideally, every new appliance standard that was issued from today would have that sort of smart readiness built in, so that once we have a stock of appliances, they can become a kind of an integral part of the energy system. Likewise with buildings, every new building code should have on-site renewables, it should have state-of-the-art building energy management systems, and it should be a flexible resource for the energy system as a whole. So we need to get policymakers to start to modernize the traditional approaches as well. It's not to throw them away, they still have a massive amount of work to do, but it's these additions, these tweaking of the existing policy measures that we need to see. I'll stop there for now, and happy to join in the debate.
Excellent. Thank you so much. I really like that approach. We're inviting to improve the policies, to modernize, to adapt to local needs, but with a sense of urgency. The figures you brought, we all agree that the IA approach and the data you produce is critical because it grounds us, right? It says we're also needing to see a scale of a transformation that this sector has not delivered before. So we need to see that effect of reducing by 20%, you said, the energy demand, I think was the figure you said, as the sector also continues to retrofit and grow. So there's the challenge in that's why the scaling up of the principles is such an urgency, because without good regulation, improved regulation, we're going to have it even more uphill. So in that sense of bringing solutions, Luis, and you've been focusing on housing, which is so great, because by volume, it's the biggest asset, around the world. And I would like to ask you if you could share from the work you've been doing on decarbonizing in housing across OECD countries, what role can policies play to meaningfully advance decarbonization, including the electrification imperatives that have been also mentioned by other panelists? And what pathways do you see for different geographies across the countries you collaborate with?
Very good. Thanks, Christina, for this. I think you are really touching at putting your finger on the core issue here. I think we all recognize that there isn't one single policy lever that can be used to deal with these challenges that we are talking about today. It's really a combination of policy areas. It's a combination of policy instruments that need to be considered. It's really about designing packages of policies rather than focusing on one element in isolation. I think there are several such areas and options that we need to focus on. One thing that I think is fair to say is that there is really increasing awareness around the world about the importance of the building sector in decarbonization strategies. I think that there is a growing number of countries that are singling out the sector itself in their strategies, others that are recognizing the specific challenges that the sector presents and that need to be addressed. Countries are really evolving in different ways. Different jurisdictions, even within countries, are considering different options. One has to obviously look at local conditions, local specificities, not only differences in geography and climate around the world and even within countries, but local conditions and needs and preferences of society. But I would say that there are a number of policy areas that are crucial here. I mean, one is that I think Melanie has already mentioned, the issue of distinguishing new buildings from the existing building stock. When one talks about the new buildings, it's really a matter of designing norms and standards that need to be followed. It's a matter of making sure really that state-of-the-art standards are locked in, given the very long life cycle of buildings. So to make sure that you already start off using the best technologies that you have at the moment. And there we see big differences between advanced economies and less advanced economies. The housing stock is likely to grow, or buildings are likely to grow faster in developing countries and emerging market economies, because that's where population growth is fastest right now. And those are the parts of the world where building codes are either not in place or that the standards of construction and buildings are not state-of-the-art from the point of view of energy efficiency, the use of energy, even in terms of the technologies used in the construction of new buildings. A lot of, I think, that there is a scope for policy action to support innovation, technological change in the building sector itself, new technologies of construction, for instance, that will definitely play a role by reducing reliance on energy-intensive materials, by basically promoting more adapted ways of building to local circumstances. And again, it's about applying state-of-the-art technologies through in the construction phase. Also policies that have to do with investment in energy retrofitting for older or below standards buildings. This is a particularly complex part of the equation, as we all know. It basically requires dealing with the split incentives between landlords and tenants, for instance, if you're talking about the rental residential market. It's about de-risking investments so that the costs of financing for such investments can be lowered. It's about raising awareness about the energy efficiency and the thermal properties and characteristics of homes. We know from surveys that households typically don't know about how efficient or inefficient their homes are in terms of energy consumption. And it's also about changes in behavior so that demand patterns also shift towards lower energy consumption and greener buildings. All that can contribute, of course, to lower energy consumption, to savings in that area. Again, it's about raising awareness, but also, equipping homes with energy use management devices and so on. It is, there is a variety of policy areas that come to bear here. I would say to conclude in this respect that progress in all these areas will basically involve reform across a range of sectors in our economy. It will involve private-public partnerships. It will involve mobilization of finance. It will involve support for innovation. It will involve changes in habits and consumption patterns and so on. It will obviously require very constructive engagement among governments, financial institutions, social housing administrators, regulators, innovators, and all those different policy communities that we just identified a minute ago in the previous segment. And that's where I think that your principles can help a lot, because the principles allow us to connect all those dots and make sure that we move in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you. That's excellent reflections. Just before I move on to the next question, I wonder if someone from the panel would like to add to that vision that Luis was sharing. In my mind, I thought about imagine those policy packages moving in that direction and making the industry innovate, be more productive, gain that competitive edge, make the most out of the conversation around improving quality of infrastructure, and how that actually it's just good business, not only good for people, but good for improving the quality of what the sector does. That's what sparked in my mind.
Yeah, one point, Christina, if you allow me just to say that
yes,
it's an aspect that I think we all know that is very important, but connecting policies in this area to broader urban development strategies as well. The development of transport systems, the urban planning, land use regulation, and these are all other aspects of policy that will eventually impact on where people live, where they want to live, where they can afford to live, the amenities that they have, and all that will shape, at the end of the day, how we use energy in our own homes, in the places where we work. So, there is a lot that can be done as well in all those areas of urban planning, transport infrastructure, design of infrastructure in general, that can help as well.
Totally. You're totally right. Thank you. Thank you so much for that. Brian, I would like to go to you, because also you've seen that the principles in coming in this network, let's say collaboration, also bring closer together the energy transition with the built environment, but also with the social value that also Luis was describing in that systemic thinking, the social value and the aspects of bringing communities up in front. I know from your work, you are a SDG 7, I'll spell it out, is affordable and clean energy, right? And your work is also, let's say, a brother to WorldGBC in terms we're also seeking that availability for everyone. I'm keen to have your views on how all of this accelerates the SDG agenda from the focus you have, also from the view you have on your leadership on SE for All.
Yeah, so obviously our view is that sustainable energy is key for achieving all the sustainable development goals, and that the philosophy that leaving no one behind, and that we've got billions of people with varying levels of energy quality and energy access, being able to start with where people are living, where people are working in the built environment, really brings that personal perspective of achieving the sustainable development goals. So in that light, including items like equity and access, health and resilience are really good examples of how you bring it down to the personal level. And as an example, in the resilience section, the concept of passive survivability, I think, is really, really critical and great to see in there. It's in alignment with the philosophy in our Cooling for All program, which recognizes that cooling is not a luxury. And it is measures in the built environment like cool roofs, external shading, even nature-based solutions, so linking into the biodiversity one, nature-based solutions like shade trees that can actually improve survivability in buildings during extreme heat events, which extreme heat events are also those times when the power goes out. So you can't always necessarily rely on in individual homes having air conditioning working, but you can then have cooling centers in communities that do have backup energy systems that can always create a safety zone for those vulnerable populations. And so, you know, it's really great to see this passive survivability, and then also recognizing that, well, you know, having other energy systems in place in community scale systems is another opportunity. You know, we see over 1 billion people that are at high risk due to a lack of access to cooling. So this is a particularly important one for us. Also, you know, if you achieve passive survivability, you're actually achieving energy efficiency, and you're supporting the achievement of SDG 7. Same thing, if you're achieving access to sustainable homes, you're achieving energy efficiency, and you're helping to achieve SDG 7. So all these principles have an energy lens. And so that's what I think it's really important to open the door to other communities, but recognizing that there's an energy benefit for doing each of the items in the principles. I also like that the document's relatively simple and can be built on. Oftentimes we start with really long documents and have to boil it down. This is starting the other way around. It's saying, here's a simple document, policymakers, look at this. We'll help you figure out the details. There's details in here, but we can, you know, always create hundreds of pages of documents. But this one is a really great, simple, easy to read document. So really appreciative of that as well.
No, thank you, Brian, for spotting that. Yes. So if for all of you that are listening to us, look at the document. It's short and simple to communicate, and it doesn't mean that it's let's say a done deal, but we have the right sets of, let's say, of people around the room and stakeholders that can champion this in every geography. And thank you, Brian, for bringing in those billion people today already vulnerable to extreme heat. And also there's people even now in sub-Saharan Africa that when the extreme temperatures are vulnerable to cold. And this goes to also to the inequality of the housing and the infrastructure that is laid out. And of course, the SDG 7 is around also providing access to energy. We need energy to grow and to thrive as a civilization, but we cannot waste it any longer. So I think what we're also asking is, let's do something differently now. We don't have more time. And Rosilena, in that spirit, going over to you and your work in the government of Panama, we're all are fans of your leadership and what you do, and we love that. You know that the sculpture you have in the back. So can you share with our audience, and in relation to the principles, also the imperative of SDG 7 and building on what Brian said, based on your experience in countries that are facing similar realities to Panama, what are the low-hanging fruits to deliver urgently on this agenda?
Thank you very much for the question. And I have to say that, as Brian mentioned before, we are building this energy transition agenda using, yes, the index of the indicators of the SDG 7, but for us it's more than that. We are using as a cornerstone all the SDG 7 SDGs agenda, including the 4Ds concept: digitalization, decarbonization, democratization, and decentralization. And from the beginning, we start an open and honest dialogue with all the different civil society associations. The private sector fully was committed in the process, as well as the public sector. And after starting that in 2019, this process ended with a national energy transition agenda integrated with national strategies, 3 roadmaps focusing on fostering non-conventional renewable energy, electromobility, distributed generation, also energy efficiency for sure, universal access to energy, modernization of the electricity transmission and distribution infrastructure, green hydrogen, but also including gender and strategic communication for the population as the stars of the energy transition. And this agenda that have 182 lines of actions to be implemented between 2030 and between 2020 and 2030 have the potential to reduce around 60 million tons of CO2 by 2050. That represents the 95% of total Panama emission reduction commitment, and the 25% of that is coming from energy efficiency in buildings. And during this, I have to say, 3.5 years, Panama's power generation have changed a lot. More than the 80% of our power generation comes from renewable energy. And between May and October, we are about 90%, and sometimes 3 months in a row, we are over 97%. And in addition, the distributed generation in buildings have grown by 56% in the last 2 years. We can see also how the infrastructure regarding the public chargers nationwide has grown as well. Right now we have 184 chargers. And we have developed also announced a sustainable construction guide, built hand by hand with the local governments. And at this moment, we are also focusing a lot of education. Right now, we have launched a scholarship contest for Panamanian professionals to want to be certified as energy efficiency experts, and also that want to be certified as developers of green hydrogen and derivative projects. We are currently right now designing technical specializations for the energy transition. So the same person will be able to develop the skills to install photovoltaic system chargers for electric vehicles and also do the maintenance of these vehicles. We are also carrying a program for the youth as the SDG 7 Academy, that is a leadership program, not only to include the skills that they have to drive changes, but also technical information for them. And also we are just 1 week before launching the documentary of our solar champions that are women from the rural areas, indigenous area that right now are not only professionals able to install solar water heaters and solar rooftop, but also they are part of the professionals of the Panamanian Solar Chamber that are doing entrepreneurship in their local communities to foster the energy transition. But as the energy market in Panama belongs 99% to the private sector, in the last 3 years, we invest more than 15,000 man-hours to analyze, discuss, evaluate how to work together, prioritizing the different expectations of the private sector and society have. We create a platform to drive the energy transition within something that we call the National Energy Transition Committee, that this is a high-level committee that has 6 technical committees to implement the energy transition. For us, the main lesson learned here is that if we want to go far, if we want to implement fast, we have to invest a little bit of more time working and understanding each other before and during the implementation. I just want to recall that the increment of the use of these type of technologies within the infrastructure for the revenues that we are expecting to have in 2050 for this are around $44.5 billion US, and the investment required to achieve that is around $21 billion. That means that yes, the effort that we want to implement is necessary in order to harvest not only development, but also a sustainable one And for us, the relationship and the network that has been growing for the last year, not only within the country, but outside the country, has been key to assure that after we finalize our government administration, people, not only the private sector, but also the general population knows about the energy transition and will be advocates to continue in this.
That is so amazing, Rosilena. It is what every, let's say, country should start to understand, because sometimes this sector is, oh, it's difficult to understand, it's fragmented, there's a lot of factors. But I think I spotted a few things that you shared with us from your amazing journey. It is about dialogue. It is around agreement on targets. You brought in innovation around digitalization that hasn't been mentioned previously today, but that is a key driver, enabling those frameworks, those platforms for exchange of the benefits of those investments and the outcomes. You talked also about engagement with key stakeholders, bringing in all dimensions of access, gender, equality, modernizing systems, and growing different resources of energy to provide a diversified matrix and growing renewables. And what I also spotted is that you said, and the goals for Panama to deliver on decarbonization, 25% is coming from energy efficiency in buildings to date, no, as you diversify, right? So that's it.
Cristina, sorry, I just want to mention that I really forgot that after reading the document, I saw opportunity of improvement in our agenda. And that is how we are going to really link biodiversity to this transition.
Oh, yes.
How we are going to use nature-based solutions to assure that the infrastructure is going to be resilient enough. So I will be telling you after.
Excellent. Yes, nature positive. Amazing. Oh, that's excellent. Excellent. No, such inspiration today. So thank you so much. Now, Melanie, at WorldGBC, we see the built environment as a key agent of change in delivering this energy transition that Rosilena so passionately now from the real world, if you like, outlined that she is enabling to happen. So the IEA often describes energy efficiency as the world's first fuel, or I also love the other phrasing, like the cheapest energy is the one you don't use. How can improved policy frameworks enable energy efficiency progress in the context of growing demand for new buildings in emerging economies?
Yes, the million-dollar question. So one of the things we've already touched on quite a bit is the concept of integrated policy packages, the combination of regulation, information, and incentives. But when we talk about that, what we need to be very clear is that not just have one of each of those things, but make sure they're designed to work together. Because if they're not designed to work together, they can work against each other, and sometimes they then actually reduce your results. So making sure that that's clearly understood and being able to advise on that basis is of course really important. You just talked about digitalization. So as I said earlier, we want to modernize each of those types of approach so that we take advantage of the opportunities that digitalization bring. And there are many. They can help policymakers implement more effective regulation, for example. They can help policymakers monitor what's happening better, and just mean that their policy settings are closer to market and much more effective. So there's huge program management benefits from digitalization. Then there's huge information benefits, of course, through digitalization as well, and which I guess are perhaps clearer. But then with incentives, we see a lot of people talking about what business models need to be developed in order to, improve the investments in energy efficiency by combining the important resources of the public sector with the much larger resources of the private sector. Say, investing in digital approaches can also help there. We can see what's happening in real time, so we can prove that investments are actually, or we can make much better estimates of what could be achieved, and then we can prove whether or not something was achieved. And all of that can be done much more easily than has ever been the case before. And And that's all important because just as a backdrop to that, we have something like 120 countries with appliance standards programs. The very best of those are using about half the energy for those appliances that they would be using if they hadn't had 30 years of extremely well implemented programs. But that's just a handful of those 120. It's less than 10. The others are achieving much less than they could be because they're not well enough implemented. Likewise with building codes, we think there are about 80 countries with mandatory or voluntary building codes, something like that around the world. But people do say that some of them are just just the paper that they're written on, rather than the really effective tools that they need to be. So I think if we pull all of this together, digitalization can help improve the effectiveness of those tools, particularly for governments that don't have the resources. The governments of the emerging and developing economies who don't have the resources to invest in the huge numbers of public servants that are available in the US and Europe, say, to do these jobs, the huge consultancy base that's there to support the decisions that are made by governments. All of that is lacking in the developing and emerging world. And so as well as sharing experience, new tools can help shortcut some of these problems that we see occur. The other thing that's been touched on a lot, but I think is even more important in the developing and emerging world, we know that energy efficiency can create millions of new jobs. It can improve millions of lives, and it can actually save millions of lives through the sorts of things that Brian's been talking about in terms of cooling and resilience there. Also, as you said, exposure to severe cold. But if we don't have better evidence of really how that actually works, and can prove to presidents and finance ministers that these things can actually be achieved, these social and economic benefits, I don't think we'll ever get near the resources that we need into the energy efficiency policy design and implementation, which is where things are lacking. So having a system where we can have better metrics, collect better evidence, do the analysis that's necessary, and then promote those benefits in a really credible way. What does it mean to be in a more comfortable building in terms of productivity? We talk about that, but we don't have enough data and evidence to say what it's exactly worth. Likewise, in terms of saving lives and creating jobs, we just need to put much more effort into those things. Then I believe we can get the more senior leaders to invest more in the type of policy implementation that is going to achieve the results that we need. But we have to make it easy for them by giving them this platform that doesn't really exist at the moment.
Point
we have
taken.
bits of it. We have bits of this picture.
We have bits, and we have bits across all of this. Yeah, they're evidence, scattered evidence. And yes, there's some, as you were saying, those 80 countries that have building energy codes, right? But we don't really have evidence of how much are they improving. We have some simulations, but it's the digitalization of the information. The information exists, but sometimes we don't have access to it. The better storytelling to inspire that this is possible and bring further confidence. Yeah, totally. But it's kind of seems it's we're coming up to the hour. I was going to say it was going to be time. It's kind of the time is really up for some deeper collaborations on improving the quality of the policies that have been dedicated to the space and bringing out the dialogue, as Rosilena was saying, that to inspire confidence in that both can move together. Let's say the private sector continuing to show the vision of the possible, but importantly, the public sector acting and giving more of a clear signal of improved packages of improvements for the building sector to be on track, both for the SDGs and for the Paris Agreement, but importantly, for people worldwide that are already vulnerable to climate change and all the populations to come. They deserve They don't need the cities, the bad cities we've built. They need better quality solutions, and helping, as we spotted, making also nature thrive with us, not in spite of us. So I would like just to pause for a second, because before I close, to see if anyone of you wants to do a final remark before I close this off. Brian?
Yeah, I'm happy to come in. And, I think it's really from the GBC perspective, obviously, the whole community is great at building local community practices. And I think with this, I think there should be a really strong push to bring in the other local communities beyond the built environment, like the health sector, like the forestry sector when we talk about biodiversity. How do we bring those other local partners in to show that their solutions are there and ready? We know that building efficiency is very cost effective, but we need to trigger those and get those local communities of practice strengthened, and then tying them to national investment plans and showing that buildings are an infrastructure investment. So I think that tie would be helpful.
I just would
Indeed.
like also to add that the basis for the success of any public policy in the short, medium, and long term is that we have to focus on understanding and contextualizing the evolving needs and expectations of the people over time. And the document with the principles really let us evaluate and ponderate if we are doing so in the implementation of the policies. And also comes really on handy, because right now we are in the middle of the path of the implementation of all the SDGs agenda. We are just in the middle. We have to find a way to make an evaluation of what we are doing, how close or far are we from the goal, and also bring the momentum that we had when we create and approve the SDG agenda. We need to go back to there and go faster in order to achieve a better quality in the 2030.
Agree. We need to tap into that spirit of accelerating momentum and making the shift. No, and I think I really enjoyed having you all today in this panel, because we also shared, let's say, that that same goal, right, of connecting, of partnering, of collaborating, and ensuring that these global policy principles could be also from your organization. You could take them on forwards, and we invite people, everyone that is listening, and stakeholders that have also the agency and the urgency to act for embracing them and taking them forward. You can scan this QR code in your screen to download the principles. And I just want to thank you all for sharing your insights and for this very interesting discussion and all your points and your support. I want to invite you to take on this tool to drive change in your local market. And we expect that we will listen in for your requests to partner up, and let's campaign. Let's become more activists in demanding better quality outcomes for a sector and for all the SDGs that are desperately, let's say, requiring that we connect with empathy, but with a sense of urgency on the needs of people today. So thank you very much for listening in and for supporting the global policy principles from WorldGBC.